Hercule Poirot and the Curse of the Inverted Hours. Chapter 1. The Last Bell at Midnight. Lady Ainsworth's residence in Hampstead, London, was one of those mansions that seemed suspended in time. Pendulum clocks in every hallway, a Gothic sundial in the garden, and such a vast collection of antique clocks in the drawing-room that one could almost hear the passing of centuries rather than seconds. That winter evening, the house was full of illustrious guests, invited to celebrate its owner's 65th birthday, although everyone knew it was not just a party, but a declaration. Lady Agatha Ainsworth was wealthy, influential, and many believed dangerous in her quiet family power play, with 3 estranged sons, a nephew who lived as if he'd already inherited, and a French daughter-in-law she barely tolerated. The atmosphere at the party was one of forced politeness and carefully timed tension. The main hall clock, a 2-metre-high Viennese monument, struck midnight with a deep, drawn-out echo. Those present toasted with champagne, hiding their thoughts behind false smiles. It was then that a shout was heard from the first floor. The maid Lily came running down the stairs, white as wax, trembling as she held a blood-soaked handkerchief. "It's Lady Agatha. Her room is locked, and she's not answering." Sir Benedict, the eldest son, strode upstairs, forced the lock of his mother's private suite, and there they found her, in her red velvet armchair, seemingly asleep. But one glance was enough to tell she wasn't breathing. On her lap, curiously, rested an antique pocket watch. The hands, however, did not strike midnight. They ticked backward. Again and again, the minute hand spun backward, refusing to obey the laws of time. The police arrived within minutes, alerted by the butler even before the door was forced. Inspector Garton, a practical man with little patience for the eccentricities of the aristocracy, conducted a quick inspection. There are no signs of a struggle, no visible poison. The medical examiner will indicate whether it was a heart attack or something more subtle. But that watch? A joke? Sir Benedict shook his head. That watch belonged to my great-grandfather. It always worked perfectly. Until tonight, the clock, as it later emerged, wasn't simply broken. It had been rigged to run backward, a tampering as deliberate as it was macabre. And that wasn't the only thing out of place. The safe behind the matriarch's portrait was ajar, and an old will, signed but unregistered, was missing. It was Lady Elise, the young and elegant French wife of the youngest son, who whispered in a barely audible voice, "Perhaps it is the curse." Everyone turned to her. "What curse?" the inspector asked impatiently. Lady Agatha always said that old clocks contained more than gears, that they captured memories and other things. She said that if you tampered with time, time would take its revenge. The police, of course, ignored such a suggestion. But the next day a letter arrived at the door of Whitehaven Mansions. It was addressed to Mr. Hercule Poirot, and the sender was none other than Lady Agatha's personal lawyer. "Mr. Poirot, a crime has been committed in the home of my recently deceased client. The circumstances are confusing, the clues contradictory, but I don't believe in haunted clocks or weak hearts. Please come as soon as possible, before time or the truth escapes us completely. Kind regards, Mr. Elwood Green." Poirot, from his armchair overlooking the Thames, closed the letter with an enigmatic smile. His fingers slowly interlaced on his chest as he murmured, A death with a clock running backwards. My God, what a theatrical symbolism! This isn't just any crime, it's a message, and I intend to decipher it. And so, as Big Ben struck 12, forward as it should be, Poirot set off for Hampstead. There, amidst stopped clocks and faces that concealed more than they revealed, a puzzle, as subtle as it was lethal, awaited him. Chapter 2. The Heirs and the Broken Will. Poirot arrived at Ainsworth Manor at dusk, wrapped in his light grey wool coat, his trademark bowler hat tilted slightly. He was greeted by the butler, an elderly man named Carroway, whose expressionless face seemed cast from the same stone as the house's walls. Monsieur Poirot, Mr. Elwood Green awaits you in the library. The library was a cathedral of dark wood, with glass cabinets filled with leather volumes and an imposing portrait of Lord Ainsworth, who had died 2 decades earlier. There, seated with British rigidity, was the lawyer. "Thank you for coming. So quickly, monsieur," Green said, standing up. "I'm afraid the situation is irregular." Poirot settled himself carefully into an armchair, crossing one leg over the other with mathematical precision. "Irregularities, Mr. Green, are usually the soul of a crime. Start from the beginning, please. Yesterday morning, Lady Agatha confided in me that she intended to change her will. She showed me a signed and dated version, although we hadn't yet officially registered it. This version left the majority of her fortune to her granddaughter, Miss Clara Venn. That would represent a significant break from her previous will, which primarily benefited her eldest son, Sir Benedict." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And that document disappeared?" "Exactly. The safe was opened. The combination was known only to Lady Agatha, and perhaps someone else. Ah, but yes, there's always someone else." Poirot looked around the office carefully. On the desk, a fountain pen had been dropped mid-stroke. A calendar marked the day with a red circle, and the time, 23:45, was written on the side. The mantel clock, however, had stopped at 00:02. "I beg you, monsieur," said Poirot, rising with feline grace, "to introduce me to the members of this very interesting family." They were summoned to the main hall, where the scent of lavender incense barely masked the tension. Poirot looked at them one by one with a searching look. Sir Benedict Ainsworth was a burly man with a square jaw and a firm voice. A former army colonel, he made no effort to hide his discomfort in the detective's presence. "We don't need a theatrical investigation," he growled. "It was a heart attack. The rest is French fantasies." "Belgian, monsieur," Poirot corrected gently, "and fantasies are my specialty." At her side, Lady Elise Ainsworth, young, slim, and dressed in refined mourning, maintained an almost artistic composure. Her gaze met Poirot's for a moment. He detected something more than pity in her. Then there was Clara Venn, the granddaughter, a young woman of about 26, with a pale face and a solemn expression. She had been raised by Lady Agatha after the death of her parents. Clara spoke little, but when she did, her words were measured, unadorned. "My grandmother told me that time was her only enemy. I guess she defeated it before it caught up with her. A strange comment." Poirot filed it away in his mind like a mental note crossed out in soft pencil. There was also the younger son, Marcus Ainsworth, a down-and-out bon vivant. He looked dishevelled and had deep dark circles under his eyes. He sat casually and took a whisky before speaking. My mother was always controlling, until the last second. Literally, the last member of the circle was Mrs. Gladwell, Lady Agatha's personal nurse, a stern woman with a sharp gaze. According to the inspector's report, she was the last person to see the lady alive, around 11:15. Poirot spoke little during the meeting, limiting himself to nodding, observing and asking brief questions. Who knew about the existence of the New Testament? Who had seen the pocket watch before that evening? Had anyone heard any unusual noises? The answers were vague and evasive. Everyone seemed surprised by the mention of the missing will, although the slight blush on Sir Benedict's neck indicated that he was not entirely unaware of it. When the meeting ended, Poirot retired to the clockroom. He approached the large Viennese clock and ran his fingers over the engravings carved into the wood. A family divided by inheritance, a symbolic death, and time running backwards, he murmured. What better setting for a crime that wants to appear something else? He turned to Hastings, who had just arrived with the suitcase. My friend, prepare yourself. This case won't be about poison or bullets, but about motivations, appearances, and above all, illusions. Chapter 3. Echoes of Midnight and Shadows. On the clock. That night the Ainsworth mansion seemed to hold its breath. The walls, covered with clocks, gave the unsettling sensation of being eavesdropped. Poirot, ensconced in the farthest guest room of the east wing, wasn't sleeping. His eyes scanned the notes he had begun meticulously organizing in his personal notebook, writing with his fountain pen in a calligraphy as precise as his logic. At 3:12 a.m., something made him look up. A faint, almost imperceptible metallic sound. Tick, tick, tick. Click arose silently, opened the door, and stepped out into the corridor in his velvet dressing gown. From the main corridor, he saw a figure disappearing in the distance, heading towards the clockroom. Poirot, without lighting a lamp, advanced cautiously. The room was barely lit by the moonlight filtering through the stained glass windows. The large Viennese clock emitted attic-tack deep, like the heartbeat of a sleeping beast. But he wasn't alone. By the window, with her back to the door, stood Lady Elise. She had a book in her hands, but she wasn't reading it. She stared at her watch, as if waiting for it to speak. It's not often you find company at night among the cogs, Poirot said softly. Lady Elise turned with a start, but then smiled weakly. Monsieur Poirot, I couldn't sleep. This house is noisier at night than during the day. Funny, isn't it? Clocks should soothe, not unsettle. Did you like them? She hesitated for a second. Me, yes. My mother-in-law, even more so. She used to say that watches showed character, that you could tell a person by the way they treated time. Poirot approached, and yet someone decided to mess with that time. Why do you think the killer tampered with the pocket watch? Lady Elise clutched the book to her chest, maybe to say something, or to hide it. My mother-in-law was superstitious but also brilliant. If the killer knew what that watch meant to her, it would have been a sure hit. Poirot nodded. A private message, in a symbolic language. They looked at each other for a few seconds. Poirot gave a small bow and withdrew without another word. He didn't need to press. The most sincere confessions. were those sown with questions and reaped with silence. The next morning, Poirot asked to see Lady Agatha's office as it had been left. Carroway, the butler, led him slowly, as if he feared the room might break with every step. On the desk were neatly arranged papers, bank accounts, correspondence, and a sheet of paper partially burned in the fireplace. Poirot examined it. The charred edge suggested a letter. A single word was barely legible. "Clara? Who found this?" asked Poirot without looking at Carroway. "Inspector Garton. He left it there. He said it was irrelevant. I didn't burn it, if that's what you're implying, monsieur." "I'm not implying anything, Monsieur Carroway. I'm simply observing that a half-burned letter is never irrelevant in a house full of anxious heirs." Poirot sat down in the deceased's leather armchair and closed his eyes. The killer had limited time, he thought, but he knew exactly what to alter: the clock and the will. He needed access, precision, and motivation. Later, in the portrait room, Poirot asked to speak to Clara Venn alone. She accepted without hesitation, with that quiet calm that characterized her. "Did you get along well with your grandmother, mademoiselle?" "As well as a granddaughter can get along with someone who plans your future without consulting you," she responded without harshness, only with resignation. "Did you know that he had decided to leave you the majority of his inheritance?" Clara looked at him strangely. "Is that what the lawyer says?" "No, I didn't know anything. And if I had known, it wouldn't have changed anything." "Forgive me for saying this," Poirot murmured with a slight bow, "but that's not quite true. A change of will changes many things, especially in a family where everyone is watching the clock, waiting for the final hour." Clara remained silent. Poirot noticed her nervously playing with a pendant. A small silver cross. "Did that belong to your mother?" "Yes," he replied, lowering his gaze. "It was the only object my grandmother allowed me to keep after her death." Poirot nodded slowly. "So maybe it wasn't the clock that stopped time, but a broken promise." That afternoon, as the shadows lengthened in the greenhouse and the house clocks ticked away with almost unnerving synchronicity, Poirot walked through the snowy garden. His thoughts turned like hidden cogs. I already knew the essentials. Only the small pieces were missing. The minutiae. The contradictions. Because in the murder of Lady Agatha Ainsworth, every second hid a lie. Chapter 4. The Midnight Confession. The snow was beginning to fall more heavily when Poirot returned to the Ainsworth mansion. Tea-time had once again brought the house's occupants together in the main drawing-room, where their gazes were no longer mournful but suspicious. Every gesture was watched, every word measured. Poirot, his hands clasped behind his back, walked slowly from one clock to the other, as if waiting for someone to confess aloud. It was then that a voice, soft but tense, broke the routine. "Monsieur Poirot, may I speak to you privately?" It was Marcus Ainsworth, the youngest son, his face paler than usual. Poirot led him into the empty office, where the walls still seemed to retain the bitter scent of the tobacco Lady Agatha smoked at night. "Hello, monsieur," invited Poirot, taking a seat at the desk. Marcus poured himself a brandy without asking. He drank it in one gulp and put the glass down with a thud. "I haven't been able to sleep since my mother died, not because I miss her, because I'm tormented by the thought that she knew. Did you know what, monsieur? That I entered his office the night he died, that I found the will. Poirot didn't move an inch. No surprise, no judgment, just absolute attention. And what did you do with that document?" Marcus looked down. "I read it. I felt betrayed. My whole life enduring his humiliation, his manipulations, and in the end it was all for Clara. Even Elise would have left, more than me, but I didn't take it. I left it where it was. I went out and went to the greenhouse to drink myself to sleep. That was around 11. Poirot nodded slowly. "And when did he wake up? With the screams?" "It was already too late. Believe me or not, I didn't touch anything." Poirot leaned towards him. "Monsieur Marcus, you are a weak man, but I don't believe you are a murderer. Don't blame yourself for your anger. Everyone in this house feels it. The important thing isn't who wanted the inheritance, it's who wanted silence." That evening, Poirot asked permission to examine the safe again. Green, the lawyer, handed him the remaining documents found inside. Most were old legacies and worthless letters. But one caught his attention. A receipt from an antique shop, dated 2 weeks before the death. The object acquired, a reverse clock. "Interesting," Poirot murmured. Lady Agatha not only knew about that watch, she had recently bought it, deliberately. Green raised his eyebrows. "Are you implying that she was the one who placed the watch on your lap?" "No, sir, but his acquisition wasn't accidental. He had a message in mind. A symbol, as you said yourself. A symbol for whom? For someone I feared or distrusted, because a clock running backward doesn't herald death. It points to a truth that has been denied." That morning, Poirot woke with a start at a sharp sound. 3 rhythmic knocks came from the corridor. When he opened the door, he found the maid Lily, trembling, holding an envelope. "They left it at the kitchen door. With your name on it, sir." Poirot took the envelope. It was sealed with red wax, unsigned. Inside was a carefully folded sheet of paper. She knew. She wrote it all down. In her diary, hidden where no one would think to look. "I won't let the truth out. It's too late. Time's up." Poirot read the message twice. Then he looked up and spoke, more to himself than to the young maid. "No, mademoiselle, time isn't over. For some, it's just beginning." At dawn, Poirot asked everyone to gather in the greenhouse. There, amid the dormant plants and the icy breath of the windows, the detective spoke in a calm voice. Lady Agatha was a woman who trusted symbols more than words. She bought a clock that turned backwards as a warning, not as an ornament. She wanted to leave a mark if anything happened to her. What she didn't foresee was that someone would try to erase that mark, by tampering not only with the clock, but also with the contents of her safe. Those present listened in silence. Clara had her arms crossed. Sir Benedict was chewing on his anger. Elise, impassive. Marcus, sweating. Nurse Gladwell, motionless as a museum piece. Poirot continued. Someone in this house feared a revelation. And that revelation wasn't just in the will, but somewhere else. A diary, a private notebook Lady Agatha was hiding. "And where is that diary?" Sir Benedict asked disdainfully. Poirot looked at him directly. "That, monsieur, will be my next quest. But I assure you, I will find him. Because Lady Agatha wasn't just murdered. She was silenced. The silence that followed was total. Only, in the distance, attic tack persistent. The clock had not stopped, and neither does Poirot. Chapter 5. The Diary That Didn't Exist. The next day dawned with a mist so thick it seemed to envelop Ainsworth Manor in a cocoon of secrecy. Poirot, after his customary meticulously balanced breakfast, a cup of hot chocolate, a croissant with orange marmalade, and a soft-boiled egg timed with Swiss precision, made his way unannounced to the east wing of the house, where Lady Agatha's private apartments were located. Clara Venn found him there, rummaging through the shelves of her grandmother's personal library. "Are you looking for something specific, Monsieur Poirot?" he asked, his tone calm, but his arms crossed. "Yes, mademoiselle," he replied without taking his eyes off a leather-bound volume. "I'm looking for something that many people say doesn't exist, a diary." Clara frowned. My grandmother didn't keep diaries. I would have known. Exactly, and yet someone in this house left a message claiming to have done so. The curious thing isn't that others don't know. It's that Mrs. Ainsworth didn't want anyone to know. Poirot approached the fireplace, looked at the ornate marble surround, and pressed a fleur-de-lis relief with his gloved fingers. With a slight click, a side trapdoor opened, revealing a wooden compartment. Clara held her breath. Inside was a small notebook, bound in blue cloth, with no title. Poirot held her reverently. When a murderess acts out of fear of something becoming known, you have to look for what he fears. Back in his room, Poirot began reading the diary. Lady Agatha's handwriting was elegant, angular, and firm, like her character. The first pages were devoted to past memories, mentions of her late husband, comments about her children, complaints about the decline of modern morals. Nothing out of the ordinary. Until an entry dated 2 weeks before her death, I received a letter. Anonymous but written in words only someone close to me could have known. It accuses me of a crime I didn't commit, but whose consequences I concealed. Could it be that by protecting one of my own, I've sealed my fate? Poirot frowned. He turned the pages more quickly. Marcus has started drinking again, and Elise is looking at me as if she knows more than she's letting on. Clara has been in the library until the wee hours. Benedict is pressing me to formalize the previous will, but I resist. I don't trust his intentions. I suspect someone wants to silence me before I speak. In another, more concise entry, written in shaky handwriting, I bought the watch, the one that turns backwards, a symbol, a warning. If I die, and that watch is with me, they'll know it was murder. I won't let my truth be erased in silence. Poirot closed the notebook with a grave expression. There was no direct confession, but there was a warning. A woman like Lady Agatha didn't leave clues by accident. She did everything with calculation. Upon descending into the main drawing room, Poirot found everyone gathered. Lawyer Green had summoned the heirs to announce the legal invalidity of the missing will. Sir Benedict smiled with a mixture of relief and barely concealed triumph. Clara remained erect, emotionless. Marcus sipped tea with the eagerness of someone who would prefer brandy. Elise leafed through a book as if it didn't belong in the moment. "Just a moment, mes amis," interrupted Poirot, holding up the blue notebook. Before we continue reading the legal documents, I think you should hear what the late Mrs. Ainsworth left behind, not in notarial ink, but with the truth of her thoughts." Green nodded to him. Poirot opened the diary and read aloud the passage about the watch and the murder. As he reached the end, the atmosphere turned icy. Sir Benedict stood up. "And you expect us to believe that notebook magically appeared this morning?" "No magic, monsieur. Just observation. The compartment where it was located was so obvious. That's precisely why no one saw it. Except for those who knew it was there. And someone knew that's why they wrote the note. They wanted to make sure that sooner or later I would find it." Elise looked up. "Are you suggesting that someone in this house was afraid of what that diary contained?" "I'm not implying it. I'm affirming it. But it wasn't the diary that triggered the crime. It was what Mrs. Ainsworth planned to do with the truth she discovered. A truth that directly affected the position of one of you." Marcus paled. "What truth?" Poirot walked slowly to the centre of the room. "That, Mr. Marcus, is what I intend to reveal very soon. But there's still one piece missing. An unfinished conversation. A lie yet to be revealed." Then he turned to Carroway, the butler who had been standing silently at one side of the room. "Monsieur, I think it's time you told me what you heard the night your mistress died. And this time, no omissions." Carroway lowered his head. "Yes, Mr. Poirot. It's time." Chapter 6. The Invisible Witness. Everyone turned to Carroway, the butler, who suddenly seemed to have aged years in seconds. His back, once erect with the discipline of decades, of service to the English aristocracy, slightly hunched. His deep-set eyes avoided Poirot's gaze for a few seconds, before settling back into hers with resignation. "It was 11:35, she began, her voice low but firm. "I had gone upstairs to take Lady Agatha tea, as I did every night. But as I reached the door, I heard voices." "What kind of voices?" asked Poirot, no longer needing his notebook. "A conversation, but it wasn't an argument. It was tense, yes, but not loud." I recognized Lady Agatha's voice. The other one was softer, feminine. And it wasn't the maid's. Poirot leaned forward. "Did you recognize the exact words?" Carroway nodded shakily. Lady Agatha said, "I won't change my mind. And if you do, you'll have nowhere to hide." And the other voice replied, "You don't understand. It's not about money. It's about her." An icy silence fell over the room. Poirot took a few slow steps towards the fireplace. "Thank you, Mr. Carroway. You've been very brave." Then he turned to those present. A woman, not the maid, someone who feared Lady Agatha's revelation. By whom? By her. A phrase that, when uttered under pressure, is revealing, because it implies protection, loyalty, perhaps it'll love. Poirot's eyes fell on Elise. "Mademoiselle, have you ever loved enough to kill?" Lady Elise closed her book with a clapdeaf. His face showed no surprise, only an inevitable sadness. "Do you think so of me, monsieur? I think it's possible, because you knew that Lady Agatha had discovered something related to Clara Venn." Elise raised her head slowly. What could my mother-in-law have discovered about Clara? That she wasn't as fragile as everyone thought? That she had ideas of her own? That she wasn't a doll for the inheritance? Poirot remained impassive. "No, she wasn't your dead son's daughter, but yours." The revelation struck like a silent bolt of lightning. Marcus dropped his cup. Sir Benedict shot to his feet. Clara fell silent. Poirot continued in a calm voice. "Deduced it from the silver pendant. It's not just any cross. It's an exact replica of the one Elise wore in a photograph of her youth in the library. And in the diary, Lady Agatha mentions something veiled. I hid the truth to protect her, but in the end it will destroy me." "That proves nothing," Sir Benedict exclaimed. "Vague words, suppositions." Poirot turned to him with a brief smile. "But no, sir, there's more. An adoption certificate in Attorney Green's private files, dated 3 weeks after Clara's birth, with a false name for the mother. But the witness signature, it's yours, Monsieur Benedict. You helped conceal that birth to avoid family scandal." Benedict recoiled as if he had been struck. "She begged me. She said a foreign woman, widowed and alone, would be torn apart by the press. I agreed for the girl." Poirot nodded. Lady Agatha accepted the lie for years. But when Elise hinted that Clara should inherit, everything changed. Lady Agatha discovered the truth, and she planned to disinherit her again. Elise pressed her lips together. "I didn't kill her. I went to her room, yes, I begged her. But when she rejected me, I left. Clara mustn't know, ever, not now." Poirot turned to Clara, who was looking at him with an expression that was not one of surprise, but of painful understanding. "Did you know, mademoiselle?" She nodded slowly. "I've suspected it for years. A woman knows her mother, even if they tell her otherwise. But I didn't know that she had been willing to kill herself for me." Poirot looked at her tenderly. "She didn't kill herself, mademoiselle. Someone helped her die." Everyone's eyes turned once more to Elise. But Poirot shook his head. "No, the murderer is not Lady Elise." He approached the Viennese clock and stopped it with a single finger. "The real culprit is someone quieter, more invisible, someone who hasn't spoken at this entire meeting." The eyes fell on Nurse Gladwell. Poirot smiled. "Mademoiselle Gladwell, would you like to tell us yourself why you administered a lethal dose of digitalis that night? Or should I?" The woman didn't react immediately, but then, with an almost contented sigh, she sat down. "He never thought of me. 30 years of service, 3 decades of listening to him manipulate his family. I was his shadow, until he decided to talk too much." Poirot bowed slightly. "And you decided that time should no longer move forward." Chapter 7. The Clue Nobody Saw. Nurse Gladwell's confession had barely settled in the air when Poirot, with a measured gesture, asked that the moment not be interrupted. No shouts, no orders, only the echo of the crime floating between the walls of the Ainsworth mansion. The nurse, sitting on the couch by the window, seemed transformed. Her rigid posture had relaxed, and although guilt didn't appear on her face, a heavy melancholy was reflected in her gaze. "Why now, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked gently. "Why not before?" Gladwell didn't respond immediately. He watched the snowflakes melt against the glass and then murmured, "Because she was finally going to destroy everything he'd held together. Mrs. Ainsworth knew no bounds. If she revealed what she'd done about Clara, she'd ruin Elise ruin Marcus, divide the house even further, all to assert her control once more from beyond the grave. She couldn't let that happen. Not again. Again. Hastings, who had remained silent until then, intervened. Gladwell looked at him with a hollow smile. "You think this crime began a few days ago? No, it began years ago, when Lord Ainsworth died, not from a fall down the stairs, as they said, but from a wrong dose of morphine. One she gave him by mistake. I knew about it, and I kept quiet." Poirot nodded gravely. Silence can be as lethal as a sharp blade. Gladwell looked away. "That was my first mistake. The second was staying, watching him manipulate his children, how he punished them with inheritances and affections, how he turned love into debt. I thought I could protect Clara and Elise. But when I heard the threat that night, I knew I didn't have time left. And then he acted," said Poirot. "It wasn't difficult," he admitted. "She was taking digitalis for her heart. All you had to do was double the dose. She left no traces, just the watch. That damn watch." Poirot narrowed his eyes. "You placed the watch in his hands?" "Yes," she replied without hesitation. "I found it on your desk. You had put it away after arguing with Elise. I took it and adjusted it so it would spin backward, like a warning, or a message for you. For me, yes, I knew you'd come. You always do when the crime has elegance. I wanted someone like you to discover it. Not the police, not a coroner. Someone who understood that sometimes killing is the last resort to right an old wrong." There was a long silence. Poirot stepped back, as if giving the truth space to breathe. Then he turned to Inspector Garton, who had just entered, warned by Hastings. "Inspector, this woman won't run away. She's been running away from herself for 30 years. Tonight, she'll stop." Gladwell nodded serenely as she was escorted out without resistance. No one stopped her. No one spoke. Hours later, dusk fell over the Ainsworth house with a different air. Clara sat with Poirot by the fire, while the great Viennese clock, finally corrected, ticked forward. "So, I'm not the daughter of a war hero?" Clara asked, not sadly, just needing to hear the whole truth. Poirot looked at her tenderly. "You are the daughter of a woman who renounced her name to protect you, and of another woman who killed to keep that secret. Your origins don't define your worth, mademoiselle. Your choice does. And now what do I do? Live. Honor both. The one who remained silent and the one who spoke. Accept your truth. And don't, or let lies determine your future." Clara nodded silently. Poirot watched as the young woman closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, there was something new in them, determination. Later, in the guest room, Hastings served Poirot's luggage, while he carefully smoothed the folds of his tie. It was a strange case, Poirot, not because of the crime, but because of what was hidden behind it. Oui, my friend, the most dangerous thing in a house isn't the poison, but the silences, the things left unsaid. Those are the things that kill slowly. And the clock. Do you think Mrs. Ainsworth really believed in curses? Poirot smiled. Maybe. But it wasn't the clock that was running backward. It was her. Her whole life was spent looking back, punishing her people for past mistakes. In the end, that was her punishment. to be remembered for what she tried to control, not what she loved. Poirot closed his suitcase, adjusted his bowler hat, and headed for the door. Come on, Hastings. The train doesn't wait, and neither does time. Chapter 8. The Final Meeting. The next morning, the main hall of the Ainsworth mansion looked less like a duelling arena and more like a courtroom. The police had removed Nurse Gladwell during the early hours, and Inspector Garton, now more circumspect, had agreed to Poirot's last request before officially closing the case. A final meeting with everyone involved. Poirot stood by the Viennese clock, his fingers intertwined, as he watched Sir Benedict, Clara, Marcus, Elise, and the lawyer Green take their seats. No one spoke. No one wished to be the first to break the silence. The snow, still lingering, formed a white veil beyond the windows, as if the outside world were deliberately sealed off. "My friends," Poirot began, in his gentle but firm tone, "we have reached the end of an investigation that has revealed not only a crime, but also a web of secrets carefully preserved for years. But before we each return to our own lives, different life, no doubt, there are some truths that must be spoken out loud, and some burdens handed over to whom they belong." Everyone kept their eyes fixed on Poirot, their expressions varying in nuance. Stoicism on Benedict's, anxiety on Marcus's, controlled coldness on Elise's, and a mixture of relief and sadness on Clara's. Nurse Gladwell confessed, yes, and her confession was sincere. But I want you to understand this. Although she administered the final dose, hers wasn't the only hand that held the poison. It was a collective accumulation of silences, omissions, and selfishness that built up this tragedy. Poirot turned to Sir Benedict. "You, monsieur, concealed Clara's true identity to protect the family. But in doing so, you denied that young woman the truth of her birth and fueled division among the heirs with a legacy that was not yours to keep." Benedict narrowed his eyes. "I did it to preserve the family's honour." "No, sir. She did it to maintain control. The same control her mother wielded with an iron fist, and which you, unwittingly, inherited in spirit." He turned to Marcus. "You, sir, chose oblivion. You took refuge in alcohol and bitterness, despising everything that wasn't given to you, instead of building something of your own. But that silent rage also allowed all of this to happen without your intervention." Marcus looked down, rubbing his hands together without saying anything. Poirot then looked at Elise. "And you, madame, you loved in silence, protected in secret, and gave your daughter away to save her from scandal. But by remaining silent for so long, you let the truth turn into poison. Lies always age poorly." Elise raised her face with wounded pride, but did not argue. Poirot then walked towards Clara. His voice lowered, almost paternally. "And you, Mademoiselle Clara, have lived under the weight of an incomplete identity. But it is in your serenity that the only hope for this family lies. You must not bear the burden of the mistakes of those who came before you. No more." She nodded without tears, with a newly acquired maturity. Attorney Green cleared his throat. "Monsieur Poirot, what happens now? Will there be legal consequences beyond the nurse's confession?" Poirot stopped beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Legally, there's nothing more to pursue, but morally, sir, each of you has work to do. The legitimate will is gone. Without it, the law will distribute the assets according to the previous document. However, Poirot took an envelope from his inside coat pocket and held it up. Lady Agatha personally handed me, in a private meeting months ago, a letter. An instruction to be followed if her death ever became suspicious. In it, she expressed her final wish that the majority of her fortune be donated not to Clara or Benedict, but to the restoration of an orphanage in Marseille, the same one where Elise was born. Elise exhaled as if her breath had been taken away. Benedict stood up. An orphanage? Yes. Because in the end Lady Agatha, in her own peculiar way, wanted to redeem herself, not with justice, but with poetic justice. Poirot looked at the letter. What remains in your hands now is not just a fortune, but the opportunity to avoid repeating the mistakes that led to this tragedy. He turned to the Viennese clock once more, which read 11:59. In seconds, the hour would strike. When I arrived here, everything was running backward. Now, the wheels of time have been reset, not because justice has been done, but because the truth has been told. He gonged the clock chimed in the hall, exact noon. Poirot straightened, adjusted his coat, and with his methodical gait began to head for the exit. Hastings followed him without speaking. Behind them, in the living room, were the shadows of the heirs, contemplating not only what they had lost, but what they could still avoid losing. Chapter 9. Lady Agatha's Last Memory. The following morning brought a noticeable change in the atmosphere of the Ainsworth mansion. It was as if the air, after weeks of pent-up tension, had finally exhaled. The snow was beginning to melt at the edges of the windows, and the clocks, until now ominous presences, ticked away with an almost restorative harmony. Poirot, although he had already sent his suitcases to the station, asked to delay his departure for a few more hours. Something still didn't add up. A small piece, yes, but a necessary one, and in truly complex cases, the tiniest pieces were the most revealing. While Hastings ate breakfast in silence, flipping through the newspaper, Poirot examined Lady Agatha's personal belongings for the last time. Lawyer Green had given him full access to a small black lacquered cabinet in her dressing room. It contained private letters, old photographs, and at the bottom a carved wooden box with gilt initials. A.R.A. Poirot opened it slowly. Inside were an emerald brooch, a lock of child's hair wrapped in a red velvet ribbon, and a letter folded several times, written in blue ink. Poirot read the heading in a low voice. For Clara, when the truth is no longer a punishment, but a liberation. With great care, he began to read. My dear girl, if these words reach you, it's because silence no longer protects me. I am not your mother, even though a part of me wishes I had been. For years I carried the weight of a decision I believed necessary. To separate Elise from you, to protect her from the cruel gaze of this society. I believed I could raise you better, give you a life without blemish. But I was wrong. Love isn't inherited like property, nor is it controlled like a clock. What I did was out of fear, not wisdom. Elise loved you secretly every day, and although I never let her call you daughter, I saw in her eyes every time she looked at you the guilt and tenderness of a denied mother." Poirot stopped reading for a moment. He took a deep breath. Then he continued, "I have no excuses, only this wish, that you don't repeat my mistakes, that you don't let the truth wither away, out of pride. If you can forgive me, do it for yourself. If you can't, understand it for her. With sincere repentance, Agatha R. Ainsworth." Shortly after, Poirot found Clara in the conservatory. She was gazing at the frozen pond where the willow branches seemed to caress the glass surface. He approached, holding the letter. "Mademoiselle, I believe this belongs to you." Clara took the letter without speaking. She began to read it slowly, and when she reached the second paragraph, her chin trembled. But she didn't cry. On the contrary, her body stiffened, as if she had received an inheritance more valuable than any will. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, "not for finding out who killed my grandmother, but for finding out who made her what she was." Poirot bowed, his head respectfully. She wanted to stop time to avoid the judgment of history, but even the oldest clocks eventually give way, and then all is revealed. Before leaving, Poirot requested a moment alone with Elise. He found her in the music room, delicately tuning an antique piano, as if her concentration was focused on keeping her thoughts at bay. "Clara already knows," said Poirot bluntly. "Elise didn't look up. And what did he say?" "That you understand." She stopped tuning and sat down at the piano. She played a soft, deep minor chord. "Is that forgiveness?" "It's the first step, madame." Poirot approached the window, looking out at the snowy garden. "Now it's up to you to decide whether you want to be part of his life or remain a shadow." Elise didn't reply immediately, but as Poirot turned to leave, he heard the first bar of a lullaby behind him. The same one Clara used to hum as she walked alone through the halls. On the train back to London, Hastings finally spoke. "Do you think Clara will find peace, Poirot?" "Over time, my friend. The truth hurts, but it also liberates. It's like an antique clock, complicated, beautiful, and precise. Sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's quick, but when you wind it up, it always comes back to the right time." Poirot took out his pocket watch. He watched it turn elegantly. And, in this case, Hastings, time at last moves forward. Chapter 10. The Grey Cell Commentary. The train sped through frost-covered fields, leaving Ainsworth Manor and all the echoes trapped between its clocks behind. Poirot and Hastings travelled in a private compartment, and for the first time in days, the silence between them was comfortable. Hastings flicked through a cheap mystery novel, the kind that always made Poirot frown, while the Belgian detective gazed at the landscape with his hands clasped over his stomach. "Are you satisfied with the outcome, Poirot?" Hastings asked without looking up from his book. "Satisfied, no. Calm, perhaps," Poirot replied in a low voice, as if speaking more to himself than to his friend. "This case wasn't a matter of pure logic, Hastings. It was an emotional labyrinth, with passageways of guilt, mirrors of pride, and trapdoors of silence." Hastings closed the book and left it on the table. I still don't understand why Gladwell left the watch trail if he didn't want to be discovered. Didn't it make more sense to hide everything? Poirot smiled slightly. Ah, mon ami, you think in terms of crime. She thought in terms of justice. Nurse Gladwell lived trapped between two loyalties, to her conscience and to her resentment. She couldn't go on living without doing something, but she couldn't escape remorse either. So she left an inverted clock, not to hide, but to signal, a cry disguised as a symbol. And what about the orphanage in Marseille? Do you think Agatha Ainsworth really wanted to redeem herself? But yes, in her own way. She didn't understand forgiveness, but she understood the legacy. She wanted to clear her conscience by giving a final gesture, something that would compensate, at least in part, for the wounds she could never or would never heal in life. Poirot leaned forward and picked up his walking stick. The interesting thing, Hastings, is that it all started with a crime that didn't seem like a crime. A woman found dead in her chair, unharmed, uninjured, with a strange watch in her hands. And yet, what was it that made me suspicious from the start? Hastings reflected. The clock? Poirot shook his head gently. No, the detail was more subtle. It was the expression on her face. Heart attack victims don't usually die with their eyes open and their lips pressed together. That woman was afraid. Anticipatory fear, like someone who knows something inevitable is coming. He paused. That was the voice of my grey cells. They didn't scream. They whispered, but I listened. Hours later, at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot reclined in his favourite armchair, surrounded by order, light, and the clean scent of his inner garden. Hastings was flipping through the newspaper in the other room. The Ainsworth affair seems to have caused a stir in the press, he commented. The Daily Mirror suggests you're a cross between a magician and a psychoanalyst. Poirot raised an eyebrow in amusement. Ah, journalists, always so prone to melodrama. I'm no magician, Hastings, just a humble worshipper of order and observation. And what will they say about Clara and about Elise? Poirot sighed, looking at a small jasmine plant in bloom. They will survive, not by force, but by truth. Unconfessed love is a seed that never germinates, but once exposed, it blossoms, even if it's too late. Hastings put the newspaper on the table. And you, Poirot, don't you get tired of carrying so much on your shoulders? Poirot smiled delicately. Sometimes, yes, but then I remember it's not about me. It's about justice. And as long as there are people willing to lie, steal, or kill out of pride, someone will have to hear what their words don't say. Someone will have to notice that a clock, if it runs backward, does so for a reason. He crossed his hands over his chest and closed his eyes, letting out a soft sigh. My grey cells, Hastings, are still dancing. And at that moment, the wall clock struck 6 o'clock with acclic, clear and punctual. Hercule Poirot, as always, was one step ahead of his time. Epilogue: The Advanced Hours. A week after the Ainsworth case was closed, an envelope arrived at Whitehaven Mansions. It was made of thick ivory paper, sealed with blue wax. On the back was a handwritten signature. Clara Elise Venn. Poirot opened it delicately as if each fold might reveal a new nuance of the mystery. Inside, he found a short letter, written in elegant, controlled handwriting, accompanied by a small photograph. Mr. Poirot, I'm writing to you from Marseille, where I crossed the threshold of the St. Croix orphanage for the first time yesterday afternoon. It had been empty, dusty, and lifeless for years. But soon it won't be. The first child will arrive next Monday. I've decided to stay here for a while. Elise, too. We're not mother and daughter according to the papers, but we are according to the tears we shared that night. Thank you for not giving us a name back, but a story with affection, Clara. Poirot looked at the photograph. Clara and Elise were standing in front of the orphanage's iron gate, an old plaque hanging crookedly to one side. They both looked at the camera, not with broad smiles, but with serene expressions, like someone who has made peace with what was, and decided to build what will be. Poirot leaned back in his favourite armchair. The afternoon sun gently passed through the curtains, caressing his face. Hastings, entering with a freshly poured tea, noticed the open envelope and the photograph between his fingers. News from Marseille. Oui, mon ami, Poirot replied with a gentle smile. Where a lie was sown, a truth will now flourish. That is the most difficult of all human transformations. And the rest of the family? Benedict has returned to his estate in Sussex. Marcus has voluntarily entered a rehabilitation clinic, I'm told, and Elise has completely left the mansion. She stopped speaking in whispers. And you, Poirot? Don't you feel, how can I put it, empty after a case like this? Poirot thought for a few seconds before answering, no, because there's no emptiness where there's clarity. Sometimes mysteries don't end with handcuffs or confessions, but with a decision finally made without fear. Poirot bent down and placed the letter on his desk, next to other mementos from previous cases. Then he took a small lacquered box and removed the inverted pocket watch. He opened it. The hands were still spinning backward. Funny, isn't it? He said. Even when time reverses, the message remains. Haven't you thought about fixing it? Poirot gently closed the lid. No, Hastings. Some things are meant to remain as they were found, as a warning, or as a symbol. A comfortable silence settled between them. The crackling of the fire, the clinking of porcelain, and the echo of still-active grey cells filled the air. Poirot finally got up and went to the window. Outside, London continued to spin. Indifferent, busy, eternal. Maybe it's time to rest for a few days, he said quietly. But only for a few days. Hastings laughed. Another case in sight? Poirot smiled without turning around. Not yet, but crime, my friend, never rests. And as the clock on the mantelpiece struck 7, punctually and steadily, Hercule Poirot sat down again. Not with anxiety, not with nostalgia, but with the calm certainty of someone who has restored order in a world where, sometimes, even time itself dares to lie. Extra chapter: The Echo of the Clocks. One rainy night in London, weeks after the Ainsworth case had been closed, Poirot received an unexpected visitor. The doorbell rang with calculated, unnerving insistence, as if the person waiting knew they would be welcomed, but also that they were disturbing the newfound peace. When Carstairs, the building's doorman, came up to announce it, Poirot raised an eyebrow. Mademoiselle Venn, here? He insisted it wasn't urgent, Carstairs added. But he said it was. Important. Poirot, always careful with nuances, stood up immediately. Importantly, not urgently. A delightful distinction. Please send her in. Clara Venn entered wrapped in a light grey coat. She didn't look perturbed or distressed, just determined. In her hands was a carved wooden box. Monsieur Poirot, he said with a slight nod. I come as one closes a page, or perhaps as one rewrites it. Poirot invited her to sit in front of the fire. You've travelled a long way, mademoiselle. To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure? Clara placed the box between them and opened it. Inside, carefully protected by an embroidered handkerchief, were several objects. Photographs, letters, a broken bracelet, and, in the centre, a pocket watch. It wasn't the inverted watch, but a new one. The hands turned forward with Attic tackling. Continuous. It's mine, Clara said gently. I had it made in Marseille, and I wanted to give it to you. Poirot took it carefully, as if holding a fragile piece of someone's soul. A beautiful watch. Classic. No secrets. On the contrary, Clara said. It's full of them, but they've all been counted. There was a brief pause. Poirot didn't speak. He let the silence do its work. Clara continued. Elise has started writing. Memoirs, she says. I don't know if she'll publish them, but it's good for her. I'm teaching the children at the orphanage to read. It's the most satisfying thing I've ever done. Poirot smiled. Children bring order to adults, even if it seems otherwise, because they force us to put words where before there was only intuition. That's what Elise says too. Poirot placed the new clock on his shelf, right next to the one that turned backwards. And what do you want me to do with this? Nothing, Clara replied. Just that it's here, that it exists in your world as a sign that things can change without being destroyed. Poirot looked at her for a few seconds. Then he nodded. And you, mademoiselle? Have you found peace? Not yet, but now I'm walking toward her. She stood up. Poirot escorted her to the door. Monsieur Poirot, Clara said before leaving, sometimes I wonder if it wouldn't have been better not to know the truth. And what do you say yourself? She smiled for the first time that night. That I would have remained trapped in a story written by others. Poirot slowly closed the door behind him. Then he returned to his armchair. He looked at the two clocks, the old one, which was turning backwards, and the new one, which was steadily ticking away. A family with two time frames, he murmured, one for understanding the past and another for living the future. His fingers gently touched the clasp of his tie. He leaned toward the fire and whispered, his eyes shining in the gloom, the grey cells haven't had their last word yet. Supplementary. Chapter: The Shadows of the Broken Compass. A few days after Clara's visit, when the London fog barely allowed the street lamps to be seen, Poirot received a telegram with the letterhead of the Watchmaking Museum from Neuchâtel, Switzerland. The sender was a familiar name, Auguste Lemoine, one of Europe's most renowned watchmakers, and curiously, one of the few capable of building mechanisms that rotated in reverse without compromising the machinery. The message was brief, the altered. Watch was my work, but it wasn't delivered directly to Mrs. Ainsworth. Client paid cash, requested discretion, French features, ordered 6 months ago. Is this related to the case? Lemoine. Poirot reread the telegram several times. Then he leaned back in his armchair, placed his fingertips together, and closed his eyes. The grey cells immediately fired up. An anonymous client. French features. 6 months ago. It wasn't Lady Agatha. The implication was clear. Someone had commissioned the inverted clock before Agatha Ainsworth died. And not as an exotic or symbolic acquisition, but as a premeditated tool. But who? And why? The next day, Poirot visited a small shop in Covent Garden, the Silver Souvenir, specializing in precision instruments, Baroque music scores, and watches. The owner, a Frenchman named Monsieur Valois, knew Elise Ainsworth well. Ah, madam, Elise, she came here often, very cultured, always asking about watches with strange complications. One day she even brought a sketch, something about a broken compass. Poirot frowned. A compass? Yes, sir. He drew a compass rose, but with the cardinal points reversed, north to south, east to west. He said it represented the world seen from the truth, not from tradition. Poirot was silent for a few seconds. Then he asked to see that drawing, if she still had it. Monsieur Valois disappeared briefly and returned with a folder. Inside, on glossy paper, was the inverted rose. At the bottom, a note in clear, elegant handwriting. What is hidden under time doesn't disappear. It just spins in the opposite direction. Poirot closed the folder and murmured, "It wasn't. Lady Agatha. It was Elise." That evening, back at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot placed the upside-down watch and the new one, the one Clara had given him, side by side on the table. For the first time, he allowed them both to beat at the same time. Madame Elise didn't kill Lady Agatha, he said aloud, but she did set the stage emotionally. The clock, the symbolism, the tension. She knew that sooner or later someone would do the inevitable. Hastings, who had been leafing through the Illustrated London News, looked up. "Are you suggesting that she provoked the crime without committing it?" Poirot nodded. She created the language of crime. And then she waited, not out of malice, but out of desperation. She wasn't seeking justice. She was seeking balance. The watch wasn't a weapon. It was a prayer. And what about the compass? Another reflection of the same, reversing the order to reveal it. The distorted compass rose, the clock running backwards. Everything points to the same desire, to remake history from its core, to start over. Poirot leaned back, but the world doesn't restart. It just moves forward. 2 days later, he received a letter signed by Elise from Marseille. It contained just a few lines. "I know you understood. I can't apologize for what I didn't do, but I can for what I did cause. The clock was a warning. To myself, but I didn't listen. Now Clara sleeps without fear. I still don't, Elise. Ish." Poirot folded it carefully and placed it next to Lady Agatha's diary, Clara's envelope, and the compass rose. Then, without another word, he approached the inverted clock, delicately took it apart, and turned the mechanism. For the first time since he received it, The clock began to move forward, not because the past is forgotten, murmured Poirot, but because it has finally been understood. He tic-tacked sounded louder now, as if time had finally approved. Supplementary Chapter 2. The Archive of Motives. One dull April afternoon, as the bells of St. Paul's faded into the mist, Poirot received an unexpected visitor at his door. It was Inspector Garton, the same man who had previously handled the Ainsworth case with his usual functional rigidity. "I'm not here to discuss old disagreements," Garton said, doffing his hat with an awkward gesture. "I'm here because something doesn't add up." Poirot invited him to sit down. The tea was freshly served. The Belgian detective observed him with his microscopically precise gaze. "Is this about Nurse Gladwell?" Garton nodded. "He's in pre-trial. Detention, awaiting trial. He hasn't spoken since his confession, but something in his statement doesn't reassure me." Poirot interlaced his fingers. "What exactly, mon ami? The motif. It holds up, but it doesn't breathe. Too structured, too precise, as if it were written by someone else." Poirot nodded slightly. He said nothing for a moment. Then he stood up, walked to a shelf next to the inverted clock, now repaired, and took out a black notebook with gilt edges. "During the Ainsworth case, I recorded every reaction. Not just the verbal responses, but the silences. The exchanged glances, the hesitations." He opened it to a page marked with a blue ribbon. He showed Garton a transcript. "Here, the night of the confession. Observe. It wasn't difficult. She was taking digitalis. All you had to do was double the dose. It left no traces. Just the watch. That damn watch." Garton frowned. "What are you pointing at?" Poirot smiled. "The word digitalis. Technically correct, but it's a term doctors avoid in favour of digoxin. Gladwell used digoxin in his reports. Only one person in the house insisted on calling the drug by its old name. Lady Agatha." Garton frowned. "Are you implying that the confession was scripted or rehearsed?" "Exactly. And here's the most disturbing point. Someone wanted the crime to seem like an emotional closure, but it was more of a calculated sacrifice." Garton leaned back. "And who, if not Gladwell?" Poirot returned to his armchair and answered in a low voice. A mind that understood how to craft not just a death, but a narrative. A woman who knew the clocks, the symbols, the right words. Elise Ainsworth. Poirot didn't nod, but he didn't deny it either. She didn't poison Lady Agatha. Not directly. But the confession was induced. How? Through manipulation. Gladwell, worn down, emotionally fragile, was guided toward a convenient interpretation of the facts. To protect someone. To protect something. Garton rubbed his chin. And what was the real motivation? Poirot took another sheet of paper out of his notebook. It was a copy of a letter addressed to a notary in Geneva, signed by Elise, dated 4 months before the crime. In it, she requested guidance on the procedure for formalizing Clara's legal adoption in Switzerland, out of reach of the Ainsworth family. Lady Agatha discovered this intention, said Poirot, and she was going to prevent it with all her might. The only way to prevent her from doing it was to remove her from the path, not with poison, but with pressure. Garton stood up. He walked to the window. He watched the London traffic with a frown. And what does one do with a truth that cannot be proven? Poirot replied without getting up. The guard, not for the court, for the soul. Garton turned around. And you are at peace with that? Poirot looked at his folded hands. Then, with a sad smile, he said, In justice there are laws, but in truth only conscience. I don't punish, mon ami. I reveal, and sometimes that's enough. When Garton left, Poirot walked slowly to the inverted clock. He opened it with its small key, removed the glass, and extracted from the hidden depths a folded letter. It was the original, Gladwell's first confession, dated 2 days before Lady Agatha's death. I can't take it any more. I can't continue serving a woman who destroys through silence. I've been an accomplice before. I won't be again. If something happens, let it be known. I didn't prevent it. G. Poirot had found it the night of his arrival, but he never showed it, because the crime wasn't just about death. It was the design. Supplementary Chapter 3. The Mind That Embroidered Shadows. The following afternoon, the sky over London seemed covered in a layer of leaden ink. In Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot sat, alone at his desk, holding an unreturned parcel. It had arrived by special mail, marked only with the initials E.A. The handwriting, though disguised by a different hand, was unmistakably familiar. Carefully, he untied the linen cord and lifted the lid of the box. Inside, wrapped in a blue linen cloth, lay a thick notebook with an ivory leather cover. Upon opening it, Poirot knew at once what he had in his hands. It was a diary, the real one, but not Lady Agatha's. It was Elise's. I started this journal so I wouldn't become invisible to myself. Sometimes a woman, when she remains silent for too long, begins to forget what was hers and what was imposed on her. This notebook is my mirror, the only one where I don't judge myself. When Clara was born, I didn't cry. Not because I didn't feel love, but because I knew crying would be the first step toward losing her. Agatha offered me a deal. She would remove the stigma of being a single mother, in exchange for becoming a nobody. I accepted, not out of fear, but out of faith that one day, when everything fell into place, she would know who I was. But I didn't imagine the clock would turn so slowly. Poirot read slowly. Each line seemed written more with conscience than with ink. It wasn't a confession in the judicial sense. It was a letter to the soul, woven over a slow fire. When Agatha decided to reverse the will, I understood. It wasn't a question of money. It was her final battle for the narrative. For her, Clara could only be an heir if she didn't carry my blood. A symbol, like everything in her world, watches, speeches, inheritances. So I, too, adopted the symbol. I had the clock that turns backwards made. I hid it where I knew she'd see it. And I did so, knowing she'd understand. It wasn't murder. But it was a psychological blow, and she, in her pride, shot back. He died of something slower than poison. He died of fear, the fear of losing the story that had been embroidered over our lives. Poirot stood still. The revelation didn't surprise him, but its rawness shocked him. There was no hatred in those pages, only icy logic enveloping a lost love in layers of silence. I didn't ask Gladwell to kill, but I didn't stop her either. A hint was enough. A whisper, a phrase thrown out like someone dropping a match in a dry room. I didn't direct it, but I gave it the stage. That's why I'm writing this, Hercule Poirot. Because if anyone is going to know everything, it should be you, the only one who understands that crime doesn't always take the form of a bullet. Some crimes breathe with elegance, they dress in sacrifice, and they drag on for generations. Poirot closed the notebook. He stared at the lid for a long time, not touching it again. Then he got up and put it away in a locked box. I wouldn't hand him over to the police. I wouldn't show it to anyone. Because sometimes, he thought, the whole truth doesn't serve to condemn, but to understand. That evening, as the rain pounded against the glass to the beat of an old-fashioned metronome, Poirot placed 2 clocks on the mantelpiece, the upside-down one and the new one, its hands perfectly synchronized, one for memory, he murmured, and one for hope. Then he turned off the light, and as London continued to spin in its nocturnal dance of shadows and gas, in a corner of Whitehaven Mansions, the great detective's grey cells rested, knowing that even crimes that cannot be proven can be understood. End of the last supplementary chapter. Final chapter, The Truth That Returns to the Centre. A week after closing Elise's diary, Poirot received an unexpected invitation. It was simple, plain, written on a white note card in immaculate black ink. Mr. Poirot, we're reopening the Ainsworth Mansion Conservatory as a community gathering space and public garden. Clara would like you to be present for the opening ceremony, not as a detective, as a witness of the new times, Elise. Poirot read the note 3 times before replying. This wasn't a matter of courtesy. It was a symbolic summons, a closure not of the crime, but of its echo, a rearrangement of the human pieces that had turned, like an inverted clock, in the opposite direction to the heart. The Ainsworth mansion remained imposing, though now with a warmth that had previously seemed impossible. The walls had been whitewashed, the clocks restored to their correct time. The main hall had been emptied of relics, and the dark carpets had been replaced with pale wood floors. But the most surprising thing was in the greenhouse. Where there had once been tension, there was now colour, winter flowers, chairs arranged in a circle, a modest lectern in the centre. Clara approached Poirot with a genuine smile. "I'm glad you came. I was afraid that, after all, you wouldn't want to see what was left." Poirot greeted her politely, and with a long look. "I didn't come to see what was left, mademoiselle. I came to see what you started." She led him to the lectern. "Would you like to read the opening speech?" "What?" Poirot tilted his head. "No, no, mademoiselle. This is your new time. I have only helped to rearrange the old one." Clara nodded. She turned to the audience, a few discreet people, neighbours, former employees, and spoke clearly. This place was a witness to secrets, fear, and silence. Today, we've turned it into a space for words, memory, and encounter. One story died. Here, another begins today. There was a sober, intimate applause. Elise, standing in the background, maintained her composure. She didn't cry, but when her eyes met Poirot's, she nodded, a gesture without absolution, without excuse, just truth. Later, while tea and pastries were being served in the garden, Poirot met Inspector Garton, who had attended out of uniform, as a friend and observer. The two of them moved away from the hustle and bustle. "I guess we'll never know everything that happened in that house," Garton said. "All? No, but enough," replied Poirot. "The rest belongs to what the French call the silence of the heart. And what does that mean? The silence of the heart. It's not the same as omitting. It's choosing not to hurt more than necessary." Garton thought for a moment. Then he raised his cup. "To justice, and his way of finding it." Poirot smiled, in balance. Before leaving, Poirot glanced one last time at the Viennese clock in the hall. Its hands, which had once run backward, now ticked forward with a steady, elegant tick. But it wasn't the same watch. Poirot knew it. Elise had replaced it with an exact copy, as a symbol. The original, the one from the crime, the one with the message, was kept in a Swiss watchmaking museum, bearing a plaque that read, "Time can be deceiving, but it always reveals." And so, with his suitcase in hand and his walking stick under his arm, Hercule Poirot left Ainsworth Manor. The pieces had been set. The board was cleared. The clocks reconciled. As he crossed the threshold, he murmured, "Time never lies. Just wait." And with that last thought, the great detective disappeared into the London morning mist, while in his inside pocket, Thesmal grey cells, they danced, still active, waiting for their next challenge.